But let's get started. I have a lot of ground to cover today. And there's a big question, I think, especially in the field of apologetics, is especially because the world of naturalistic atheism and Christianity are often juxtaposed. And the big question is, what would it take for an atheist to convert to Christianity? What does it take? And these are questions that we all seem to be quite curious about, especially in this day and time when we're living in increasing secularization of culture, increasing marginalization of Christianity and culture, and it seems like the possibility of atheist conversion to Christianity seems more and more remote. If God is good, and he's the source of abundant life, of unconditional love, of belonging, acceptance, and satisfaction, if God is true and can be shown through evidence, reason, and logic, and revelation, why then reject the God who is good and true and life-giving? We've all seen many flatly reject God in the face of much evidence, and it begs the question, why? Some of you may know an atheist. Some of you may have someone personally in your life that you're concerned about who's resisting God, or perhaps some of you may have your own doubts about God in your own life. In my PhD research, I sat down with over 50 former atheists who had become Christians to hear their stories and their perspectives. I wanted to better understand three things. Why were they atheists? Why did they reject God? How and why they were open to considering another point of view, particularly Christianity. Was it evidence and reason, or was it something else? And how did they eventually become followers of Jesus? The stories were simply extraordinary. Every life change was a story of an amazing God who made himself real to them in a way that they could not deny. Today, I'd like to give you a bit of insight into what I learned through this study, especially through three stories in my research, and hopefully it will help you better understand those who are resistant to God. I think, first of all, it's important to realize that religious conversion is not an easy thing for anyone. The leading researcher in religious conversion, Louis Rambo, says that resistance is the most typical response for individuals and or for societies. Because think about it, it requires enormous life change. It requires a change in the way that you see life, the way you do life, the way you live life, the way you answer the big questions. And for most, it's too much. Think of what it would be for you if someone said, I want you as a Christian to become an atheist. Well, that would involve a lot. You've invested a lot in your life, in your lifestyle, in your way of thinking, of living and believing. It would take a lot for you to change. Would you be resistant to something else if you believe what you believe is real and true? If so, then you could perhaps get in a little bit into the skin of an atheist who, when we're asking them to believe like we do, the resistance that might come, because there's a lot invested in our beliefs, why and how we hold beliefs. But we also want to get into the head of the atheist and hear what they're thinking about religion and Christ and Christianity and Christians. For them, for the atheists, the way that they view religion generally and Christianity specifically is that it is nothing more than serving a mere function. It does something for the individual. It gives them a sense of belonging socially. Emotionally, it gives them an emotional crutch. It gives them a sense of comfort. There's a sky daddy. There's someone to take care of them. There's a hope for the future. Things that in their mind are just illusions, but it serves a purpose for the person who's moving or running to a religion. It serves someone experientially. It gives them good feelings, and again, a sense of belonging and experience through life. But for them, what it is, For the atheist, although the Christian would say it's fact-based and time-spaced history, and we've got a lot of reason and evidence to show that, they would say, no, you're being ridiculous. There's nothing intellectually grounding about Christianity. It's a fairy tale. It's a figment of your imagination. It's wishful thinking. There's no there's no God to investigate. There's no essence to it. There's no spirituality. There's nothing supernatural that's real. So you're fooling yourself. They would say rather that it's fiction. And so in their mind, religion, Christianity, is not only not true, in many cases it's not good, sometimes even dangerous, and it's not relevant. And there's this narrative that has developed within the atheistic community that either you believe in science or religion, you believe in fact or fiction. You believe either you're rational or you're irrational. Either you're the adult in the room or you're the childish one. Just grow up. 72% of those thought that Christians were in some way deluded, irrational. 60% thought that Christians were weak, needy people. One person phrased it this way. I can read this. Atheism is a mature perspective for strong adults, and religion is for weak children and old ladies. They just don't have the intellectual honesty and guts. They have to rely on religion to get them through life. And I think that's a pretty common narrative for many who hold an atheistic worldview. In my surveying, these were a lot of the adjectives that arose to the surface as they described Christians and Christianity. We are hypocritical, intolerant, extreme, uneducated, and irrelevant. I think probably one of the most striking findings I had on my survey is when I put the attributes or the adjectives there were positive and negative attributes. One was educated. Not one person as an atheist thought that Christians were educated. Not one. That's a pretty strong negative stereotyping of Christians. We are really having to push back against a very strong caricaturing against Christianity. It's very unattractive to the atheist. One of the people in my study said he hadn't grown up around anyone who was Christian at all. And he said, my only point of reference was The Simpsons, and I thought all Christians were like Ned Flanders. He seriously did. He had no other person. Oh, Siri's asking me if I'm asking him a question. That's crazy. Had no other reference to show what a true, authentic Christian is. So when you're getting messages from culture and that's all you're getting, it's usually not very attractive or desirable. Case in point, when I was conducting these surveys, I was actively conducting these surveys and talking in these interviews, and I was getting this sensibility about who atheists thought Christians were, that they're not smart, they're stupid, they're uneducated. I passed this little church to and from where I was taking my two girls to and from school, so I passed it 4 times a day. This little billboard popped up. If God didn't exist, there would be no atheists. Well, okay, yeah, there's some substance to that perhaps, but what bothered me most about this was they misspelled atheists. I thought, okay, we have a PR problem. We don't need to aggravate the problem ourselves. I mean, certainly we are guilty of some of the negative stereotyping that we've been given, but we need to really confront this. This bothered me so much, I called the church. I said, would you please change the sign? And I drove back, forth. So finally my girls and I just got out and did it for them. So, yeah, we don't need that. So along with this negative stereotyping, then what happens is then you get a real lack of plausibility in culture generally, and particularly within the atheistic culture. So there becomes a lack of plausibility to religion, to religious belief, to Christianity, particularly intellectually, scientifically, socially, culturally, morally. And when that happens, the way that one person described it is you can just ridicule and mock. You can just dismiss without really considering it. C.S. Lewis said it this way: the most dangerous ideas in society are not the ones being argued, but the ones that are being assumed. And again, if these adjectives are being assumed about Christianity, then Christianity in the atheist mind doesn't even need to be taken seriously. We are in a moment, an ABC moment, according to Os Guinness, an anything but Christianity moment. And that's concerning. It's something that we have to confront realistically as Christians. So you have the negative stereotyping, you have the lack of plausibility that's running against us, and then you also have what we all have, and that is some sense of confirmation bias. So we're generally open to stuff we agree with. We listen to radio and television and podcasts and people that we like, social media, voices that we agree with, but we're generally closed off, or don't really pay attention too much things that we don't agree with. So we all have this sense of confirmation bias that we see what we seek. But that can become a problem, particularly in dealing with atheists, and it's usually manifested like this. There's no evidence for God. There's just no evidence for God. Are they really looking? Are they wanting to look? Are they actually seeking? Dallas Willard says it this way: if you believe from the outset that there is no knowledge of God, you won't seek it. Then your belief that there is no knowledge will confirm itself. Do you see that vicious cycle? You don't think there's evidence, you don't look for it, then it convinces you that there's no evidence. So it just goes on and on. And so it gives them an excuse to steer clear of the evidence because they're really biased against it. And of course, I want to acknowledge there's a spiritual blindness, there's an epistemic blindness, there's a lot more going on there. There is their will to disbelieve, there's a subconscious and conscious level to that, but there's also a spiritual level to it as well. When you ask an atheist why they don't believe, the first thing that you'll typically hear are objective or rational reasons. It's not scientific. Be rational, get real. I'm not going to believe in that nonsense. But oftentimes we need to acknowledge the genuine intellectual doubts that they're having, their sincere doubts, but we also need to pull back the curtain because we don't hold beliefs for merely intellectual reasons. All of us. We all hold and form beliefs for many reasons. Of course, we do have a sensibility of our beliefs and what we believe to be true and why. We are also informed by our people, by our friends, our family, our social groups, our church, our culture, our educational environments, social media, film. Everything in the culture is speaking into us. There are a lot of voices that are speaking into us, and those are influential. John Dixon says, not only do we tend to believe ideas we like, we also tend to accept the ideas of the people we like. And that is certainly borne out in research. We tend to adopt ideas of people that we like and people who like us. Our beliefs are also formed by our experiences in life, whether they be prolonged experiences, events, trauma, could be positive experiences, negative experiences with people in general, with religious people, with religious institutions. All of those things inform how we think about God and Christianity. Our sense of self, our identity. Perhaps we're too smart for God. We're too scientific, too rational, those kinds of things. And of course, there's our moral selves, the things that we want, the things that we desire. We all know that we can justify or rationalize some of our choices, and that goes true for what we think about our big worldview issues as well. So we need to think about this a little bit more holistically. Tim Muehlhoff says, nobody holds convictions or beliefs in a vacuum. Their convictions are wrapped in a story of how they got there, why they believe what they believe. So I think probably the first thing that we need to think about, again, is a bit more holistically. We need to think about the person as a whole. We need to think about their story. And we want them to tell us their stories because we want to see what's behind the story, what's informing their beliefs, where are their objections coming from. Again, they may be genuinely, sincerely intellectual, but they may be coming from a different place. They may be coming from their social group, perhaps their spouse, or the culture. It's just too uncool. What is it? Is it, again, a painful experience in their past? Is it, or even that they're just happy? They don't need God. They're totally content without Him. Again, their self, their sense of self, their desire for autonomy, their desire not to be told what to do. There are many different ways and many different places that objections derive, and we need to understand, is it because of an issue of truth? Is it an issue of goodness? Is it an issue of relevance? We need to take time to listen. So when I conducted my study, I looked at all of these influences. I wanted to look at influences both rational and experiential, social, cultural, spiritual. I wanted to see what were the influences that formed their atheism, which, if any, formed the catalyst that allowed them to open the door, and then which led them on to conversion. Was it rational and intellectual? Did it have something to do with goodness or something experiential, existential? So that's what I looked at. And just to give you a little bit more of a sense of the people group, these were determined by my examiner and really the literature as well, that this was a rather educated group of atheists. And I think that actually works in our favor to know the information from educated atheists. 40% of these had graduate degrees and above. 7 of these were PhDs. These were critical thinkers. These were thoughtful atheists for the most part. They would not be the type to be duped by religious superstition easily. So that's good, I think, for our part, because these were thoughtful people who came to Christ. In terms of the male-female ratio, it was predominantly male. There were 40 men and 10 women. It's a little bit different than the demographic currently. It's more like 2/3 men and 1/3 women, atheists in culture in the West. The average age, this is very important, I think, to know, especially in increasing secularization of culture. 57% of these in my study had little to no exposure to Christianity. They just didn't have it in their world. It was just a non-issue. 25% had some kind of nominal Christmas, Easter experience with Christians or Christianity, going to church perhaps maybe as a child with a grandparent. And then about 18% had some kind of regular experience with either Catholicism or Protestantism as a child, but that doesn't mean that they necessarily embraced faith on their own. There were really less than a handful who did that. The average age of self-identification as an atheist was 15. And I think that's not surprising, when you're coming to an age of autonomy and trying to figure things out on your own. It really happened before college. It was really during adolescence. Average age of conversion was about 11 years later at 26. In young adulthood, there were a variety of atheists in terms of, I would say, strength or weakness of, or strength of atheism, or how they held that belief. About a third were what I would call the weaker form of atheism. That is, that they wanted to, either they were a little bit agnostic about it, they hadn't really thought about it a lot, or they just said, I just lack that belief. About 2/3 were a stronger sensibility of their atheism. They had a positive affirmation that God did not exist. And about 10% were, I don't believe God exists, he doesn't exist, and I don't want anybody else to believe it either. Very anti-theist. And when they gave when they gave their primary reasons for disbelief in God, again, I broke these down into what I called functional reasons, that is, goodness, relevance, versus truth or spiritual reality. So with regard to the primary reasons that people didn't believe in God from a functional perspective, I met a Christian, I didn't like him, or I haven't met a Christian. And so there's either the religious hypocrisy or just lack of exposure. I don't want it, I don't like it, I don't need it. You know, I'm fine without God, I don't like the moral authority in my life, it's just unwillingness, or it is not appealing. And these are not unsurprising. This response was a little bit surprising to me when I was asking them why they didn't believe in God. The most prominent answer was a lack of personal evidence for God. It wasn't necessarily the objective, scientific, philosophical answer. It was basically that they didn't see or feel God. And I think that's particularly important for us as Christians in an apologetic, because if we're the hands and feet and heart of Christ, we represent God to them in many ways. So maybe we can be more palpably present as a person of God in their life. But apart from that, of course, they felt that there was a real lack of objective evidence. It wasn't rational nor scientific. When I looked at how kind of pure these influences were in motivating their atheism, those who disbelieved atheism merely for rational intellectual reasons was really quite small. You see that those were it's just not true. It didn't have anything to do with anything else, just not true. And those who said it's just not good, but it didn't, truth was not part of their decision there, perhaps they had a really bad experience in their life. But for the most part, it was a combination that God just wasn't believable, and it just wasn't good or relevant. So it wasn't plausible or attractive. And so it caused a real heightened resistance to Christianity. Nearly 2/3, 63% said no evidence would be sufficient to have convinced them otherwise of their atheism. Now that's a pretty strong statement right there, high level of resistance. And I think that as I've been thinking about it, I think it really says a few things. First of all, it begs the question of intellectual honesty. Are they really pursuing truth? If they were, they would be open to evidence, right? Secondly, I believe that it really is a bit explanatory when we present evidence and it just falls flat. It's like, okay, well, there's something else going on here, right? But thirdly, as I've been considering it, I think that it's incredibly hopeful. Because think about this. All 63% of the people who made this statement are all now amazing followers of Christ. It's almost as if the more heightened the resistance, there's a correlation to the high level of moving and shaking these people are doing for the kingdom. It's like once they got on board, they were fully on board. So I want you to see this statistic as real. There is a real resistance, and it's palpable, but we always have hope. There's no one too far from the Father's reach. But in terms of their type of resistance, there were very few that were open intellectually, emotionally, socially, or morally. Only 12% of my study said, I wanted to believe, I just couldn't. So this high level of resistance begs the question, the million-dollar question. So what happened? What was it that caused the walls to come down? What is the catalyst that allowed them to start questioning, to open their eyes, to say, well, I wonder if it's good. I wonder if it's relevant. I wonder if it's true. I will say, and just in general, that for it was about half and half. Half of them had some kind of a sudden realization or sudden desire in their life to pursue God. It was and about half of them, it was a gradual journey. Not everybody runs to religion because of a traumatic event in their life. That's oftentimes out there in the narrative. Sometimes it really is a genuine coming to a point of dissatisfaction, perhaps, and willingness to look into the other, and a gradual understanding. I will say that there seems to be this skepticism is that they don't really want to be duped by religious superstition. They don't want to be deceived, and so a lot of them are very, very careful when they approach religion. So there were a lot that had a very gradual journey. Some of them responded to some very supernatural occurrences, and I think this was probably one of the most surprising things in my study. 14% at the point of catalyst experienced either a dream or a vision or encounter with Christ that caused them to move and to be more open towards the person of God. 37% talked about some kind of religious experience or encountering somewhere through their journey. And again, phenomenal things that I heard. Oftentimes we think about religious or spiritual encountering happening in third world places or, with the Muslim population, but I'm here to tell you this is an unreached people group, and God shows up in extraordinary ways. But for the most part, when I want you to think about what opens the door towards someone being open, it's really a combination of two things, and this is just a very big generalization based upon all the stories that I heard. It's really a two-sided coin. We need to break down the negative stereotyping of who Christians are, what Christianity is, what the Bible is, all of those things. We need to break those things down. And additionally, we need to build up the plausibility. So it's breaking down negative stereotypes and building up plausibility. We need to break down the stereotypes that it's not good, true, or relevant. We need to build up the plausibility that it is. And Paul had it right a long time ago when he explained it like this: we are destroying speculations and every lofty thing raised up against the knowledge of God. And we're taking every thought captive to the obedience of Christ. I think that really sums up the sensibility of doing this. So what I'd like to do is, first of all, and most importantly, is that we can do none of this without the work of God. Conversion is the work of God. It's the work of the Holy Spirit in the heart and the mind of the individual. He uses us as his instruments, but it's really God from beginning to end. And I want to make that very clear. God shows up, again, in amazing ways, very personal and very specific ways in people's lives. What I want to do is show you those three types of conversion. One who really was pushing back because he thought Christianity was not true. He was a very intellectual journey. One who was more that God is not good, more experiential journeying. And one is that God is not relevant. And then we'll tie it all together here. But for the first story, I want you to think about the negative stereotypes that this person was probably thinking and how those stereotypes were changed to increase plausibility. So generally, again, The negative stereotyping rationally is that Christians are uneducated, ignorant, defensive, and fearful. We don't engage well. And I will tell you, there was some disconcerting information brought from them, the sensibility that they didn't think Christians were prepared to engage well. So I'm glad you're here. But generally, what we need to do is, again, build plausibility, that we are educated, intelligent, open, confident, willing to go there conversationally in apologetics and discussing the big questions and the hard issues. Because we need to be prepared, both listening to them and learning what the Christian worldview. Because when you look at the difference between the Christian and the atheistic worldview, and you looked at the best explanation for the way things are, what explains the cosmos, the world, physical nature, and what explains our human condition, our longings, our loves the best, it's the Christian worldview. The thing is that oftentimes atheists will say, I don't have anything to explain. The Christian, you do. You're the one who believes in God and all that stuff. But no, that's not true. They have a worldview to explain. They have a naturalistic worldview that has to explain everything. And in the Christian, in the atheistic worldview, I think Albert Camus says this well. He says, you must spend your life acting as if life is not absurd. And that's true, because within the atheistic worldview, you really are nothing. You're just a random collocations of atoms in motion. You're not worthy of meaning or purpose or value, or they can't explain our consciousness, they can't explain our rationality well, they can't ground it, our free will, all of these things, our purpose, meaning, everything that we hold to be valuable as humans, as well as the things that are going on in the universe that are very difficult for them to explain, origin of life, origin of the universe, fine-tuning, etc. They have a lot of explaining to do. But as compared to the Christian worldview, we have such a grand and cumulative case, a case that fits reality, a case where the book of nature and the book of scripture cohere, we have a Christian worldview that fits what we know about the world, its origins, its design, all of those things, its biological diversity. We have good reasons and grounding for all of that. We have good reasons and grounding for who we are in our humanity, that we should be very confident in that it all makes sense. But the atheists still push back. So let's talk about Jeremy. Jeremy said that atheism, that Christianity is not true, that God is not real, that God is not true. In his survey, he said what he thought about God. God is a psychological crutch, embarrassing belief, irrelevant belief, abusive, malevolent, fiction, mere social belief. He, in his own words, thought that it was a mythological zombie story, somebody rising from the dead. It was a wildly incoherent fairy tale, although he admits later that he had only a bumper sticker understanding of what he thought he knew. So let's pull back the curtain and look at how he formed these beliefs. He was a very intelligent young man. He was very intellectually driven. In terms of the way he grew up with a very intellectual father. He called him an intellectual highbrow, very scientifically minded. He grew up with, instead of the Bible on his coffee table, he said, I had Carl Sagan's Cosmos on my coffee table. For his mother was very Oprah-esque, new agey, went wherever the wind blew. They really didn't talk about religion and spirituality much at home, so it was just kind of a non-issue for him. He had a group of friends who were, he said, extraordinarily antagonistic to faith and religion. They liked to ridicule and mock Christians. They made a game of shredding street preachers. They loved to ridicule and mock. Who was he? he liked to consider himself the smartest guy in the room. He said, I realized I learned faster than other people. I was the captain of on my debate team. He said, I was very competitive, but I was not athletic. So I loved to play in the academic realm of ideas. I loved to win. And so he said he played in this playground of ideas, and he loved to win. But he said it took a while for those ideas to come and kind of filter down to his own self. He said, really, during this time, nobody really asked me about my own assumptions about reality. He said, I was just playing in this academic realm. He was a voracious reader. He had read most of the French existentialists by the time he was 14 and declared himself a nihilist. So he did take these ideas seriously. It was the world in which he lived. But he said it experientially, he liked the idea of existentialism, that he could create his own destiny and his reality. But when his nihilism started moving from his head to his life, he said when it came down from the playground of ideas into his own world, and he actually was one of the very few in my study who were actually willing to look at the actual implications of his own worldview, that he really didn't have meaning. For him, he was very driven by beauty, by poetry, by music. He appreciated all those things, and when he realized there was no grounding for those, that everything was meaningless, he said it really affected him. He moved into a place of depression and anger, and his group really engaged in heavy metal and kind of darkness and self-harm. So he moved into a kind of a really dark place. So what was it for him that brought about a change? He had this sense of intellectual superiority, but he also was starting to feel an emotional and intellectual dissonance with his own life. It just atheism wasn't working well for him. So the catalyst was, that prepared him for what happened. He went to a writer's forum, and he met a young lady there, and that always helps, whose father was not only trained he went to Trinity for a master's degree in a seminary, and then he went for a PhD in Germany. He actually studied there with Bill Craig, and they had just moved back from Germany. And so when Jeremy asked, the man, what do you do? And he said, well, I'm a philosopher. And so, of course, that piqued his interest. He said, this was the first person I had ever met who was smarter than me with regard to philosophy. It was someone who I could respectfully go toe-to-toe with intellectually, as someone whom he could respect. It was a Christian who had done the hard work. And so Jeremy asked him if they could meet together and form a philosophy discussion group. So they started meeting on a weekly basis. And I think this is real important, the way that this gentleman approached Jeremy. He said, we met every week. He didn't bring up Christianity. We talked about philosophy in a very deep and profound way. He said, he allowed me 6 months to come to the end and to really see the vacuousness of my own worldview, the dissatisfaction of my own worldview. And once that happened, then I was willing to consider something else. And only at that point, when Jeremy was ready, did this gentleman start bringing up other options, like Christianity. So he said he had a real relational patience, and I like that turn of phrase. He was very wise in the way that he approached him. He just didn't come in with, full guns blazing. So he decided, okay, if nihilism doesn't work, then I'm going to disprove all worldviews and religious worldviews anyway. And so he went on a journey to do that. He said it didn't take him long to kind of dismiss most of them until he got to Christianity. The way he talks about this phase is that he said it was almost as if you're searching through a box of wires. And when you dug down, through different worldviews, and when he dug down, he got to the wire that was Christianity. And he said it almost as if it shocked back, that it had something to hold on to. Another thing happened was that he moved to a point of, okay, I'm going to try to disprove Christianity. But he moved from a place of disproving eventually to really just wanting to know what was true. He said these questions started keeping him awake at night. Part of the journeying for him was that, he says, this is providential. He said, my mom went into a cigar shop to buy a cigar for my dad. It was his birthday. And when she was in there, there was a book laying on the counter. And it was called the book, The Case for Faith. And the shop owner said, oh yeah, we have a Bible study here called Holy Smokes. And, but if you think your son could use this, go ahead and take it. So he took the book home, and she took the book home. He found it, and he said, I read it in a weekend, got out my legal pad, as debaters would do. I was writing down all of my arguments against the author, but he said it was so frustrating. It was like playing chess with someone who was really good, because he was answering me, my rebuttals and on and on. He said, now that book didn't convince me, but what it did was it introduced me to those whom he had interviewed in the book. So he started what he calls a bread trail, going down a breadcrumb trail of looking at evidence and reading Bill Craig, Alvin Plantinga, Augustine, doing all these really thoughtful searches and thinking about aesthetics and metaphysics and ontology, and you just name it. He was a very bright and thoughtful guy. So he got to a point after 18 months that he was philosophically and intellectually convinced that God was real. But he knew that there had to be something more than that, and he knew that he had to have an experiential knowledge of Jesus. And so he decided to try on Christianity in the sense that he actually, for the first time, set foot in a church building. For him, he said it was very strange, dark room, people raising their hands. He said, where's the Kool-Aid? This is really strange. But he sat there and he observed and kind of absorbed it for a while. He said after about 6 months, he sensed that there was something real. He had been there, and he said, I knew I couldn't have all my questions answered ever. That's just the kind of mind that he had. He said, but at some point you have to make a decision. So he said, I decided to pray to God. If you're real, show me. And he said, what happened then, I just got chills. What happened then was one of two profound spiritual experiences that he had in his life. And what happened essentially is that he was shown, he said it was almost like he went up to a door and he knocked on it, and the door opened, and God showed himself in the sense that it was this overwhelming power. He said, talk about an existential crisis. It was as if he could uncreate me. I mean, he sensed the power and the reality of God as a person, but he also simultaneously felt the goodness of God in the same way. And that was a very common, just as a little rabbit trail. And in the spiritual experiences, it was often the case that there was a sense of holiness and power and a sense of one's own sin, but often an overwhelming sense of love and goodness at the same time. So but for him, he felt that. And so after that experience, that's when he said, I considered myself a Christian. So, wonder if God's showing up here. I think it's just the air conditioning. But anyway, just for us, again, pay attention to what the catalyst was. It was an intelligent, informed Christian who was willing and able not only to know, but to discuss well, to have relational patience, but also to invest, be willing to invest for the long haul, okay? So I think that's our lesson here. Now, in terms of those who just continue to say there's no evidence, they really never reach the point of like, okay, I'm willing to listen to evidence. like Germany was. There may be something going on that's different, or underneath the surface. You're peeling back the layers. Like Frank Turek says, he probably said it earlier this week, you can ask them the question, if Christianity was true, would you believe it? If they say no, there's something else perhaps going on. So let's look at a story where someone just doesn't think that God is good or Christianity is good. The negative stereotyping, Christians are intolerant, bigoted, dangerous, uncaring. How can we break down that stereotype and build plausibility of Christians being generous, loving, safe, and caring? Think about that as I tell you this story. Because we want to see God's love in action through his people. Gary thought that God wasn't good. God was irrelevant. Christianity was false, antiquated, superstitious ideology. It was just a big bag of nothing. God was mocked, not relevant at all. It was just a joke, religion. It was a joke, weird. So what caused him to think about those things? Well, he really wasn't so much an intellectually driven person. He developed his ideas through his culture, really. He grew up in a nominal Catholic culture in the Northeast. He had some ritual with Catholicism, a little bit of that growing up, but not much. His friend group really made fun of religion and religious people. In terms of his family, his father was an alcoholic, and he felt the weight of that. He himself, Gary, was the younger of twin boys. The older boy was considered, especially by the father, as the golden child. Gary himself was almost treated like the stepchild. He felt that difference. He felt a lot of emotional abuse, a little bit of physical abuse from his father, and he had a lot of pain associated with that. And when that happens and you don't have that father in your life, and this is true for some, not for all, he actually found a source of an older male figure in his neighborhood who befriended him. And he thought he was safe, but he wasn't. After he gained the trust, that man gained Gary's trust, he sexually abused him. And that's, he said, where things went dark. Love shouldn't hurt. Experientially, he was experiencing a lot of pain that manifested itself into anger. He didn't feel worthy to be loved. He didn't feel worthy to be loved by his own father, and he set out to prove that. And how did that happen? He had a lot of personal pain and doubt and disappointment with God, and his catalyst comes in the form of a bit of a traumatic event that happened in his life. The best way for Gary to expend his pent-up pain and anger was to pin somebody on a wrestling mat. He said it was a great outlet for him, all this pent-up rage. He said when the whistle blew, it was almost as if they flipped a switch in him and he could just pin somebody within about 15 seconds. He said, during practice, the coaches wanted to challenge me, so they kept matching me with bigger and stronger and older young men. So he, at one point, became outmatched, and he found himself with his neck broken in 4 places. So he ended up in the hospital. At that point, he wasn't crying out to God or anything like that. It continued to reinforce his understanding that God wasn't good. He couldn't believe in a God who would allow everything in his life. God wouldn't allow him to have an alcoholic father. God wouldn't allow him to break his neck, all of those things. So he was just steeped in that. He was in his hospital bed, and he had a nurse named Dolores, and Dolores would come and care for him physically. She was an excellent caretaker for his physical needs, but she did something over and above. She really cared for him. She came to him and she said, Gary, oh, and by the way, these names are not their names. These are pseudonyms to protect their identity. And I just want to make that clear. She said, "Gary, would you mind if I prayed for you?" And he said, "No, I don't want you to do that. I don't believe in God. It's a bunch of nonsense." She grabbed his hand and she bowed her head and very kindly started praying over him. I said, "How did that make you feel? Were you angry about that?" And she said, "No." He said, "No, I think I could see that she was a very kind and sweet person." And then she finished praying, and then she said, "Gary, can I read the Bible to you?" And he said, "No, that's a bunch of nonsense." So she pulls up a chair, and she sits down, and she starts reading Proverbs to him, 3, 5, and 6, and on. And he said, "And here comes Dolores, day after day after day." About the third day he was in the hospital, his aunt and uncle come, and they bring him a Bible. They had come to faith like 3 months prior to him being in the hospital. He just didn't know it. And they brought him a Bible, and he opened it up. And of course, the verses that were highlighted were exactly the verses that Dolores had read to him. And he thought, something's going on. So it softened him enough that moment, that day. He prayed to God. He said, "God, if you're real," that kind of prayer. After that, his family and his community and the church community just started showering him with love, with meals, with every need that they needed. His father came to Christ, and he said, "By the time I got home," he said, I started to reject the identity that I was an atheist. I started believing that perhaps maybe there really are some good people in the world." Then he went to church, and he said he walked in the youth group room, and he said there was Jesus. He said, like almost literally. The youth pastor, he said, looked like Jesus. Beard, hair, everything. And he said he loved me like Jesus. He was like the big brother I never had. He was the father I never had. He came to my basketball games. That was the only sport I could play. He would tell me how great it was to come see me. He would pick me up on his motorcycle. He would take me out and get, Coke and just talk about my life. And he said it was all of the love from a man that I had never had, but he was safe. And he showed me Jesus. And he showed me how Christ could meet my needs. And he showed me how the Bible meant something, and it meant something to my life. And over a course of 3 years, he came to the point where he felt loved. He felt forgiven. He felt that Christianity was true. And he actually came to be a leader in his high school. He started FCA. And even today, now as an adult, if you met him, he has a superimposing physical presence. He's almost like Mr. Clean. He's got the shaved head. He's got a big facade, physique. He actually is a business executive. He's kind of the type that comes into a business and, ships it up and shapes it out and all of that. And so he has the opportunity to engage with a lot of people in a very secular environment, in different businesses. And he said, "You know what I do now?" He said, "I still minister to people the way that Dolores ministered to me." He said, and he actually has a degree in counseling as well. So he has a very good read on people. And he gets people to kind of tell him their story. And then he says, "I'll just tell them that I want to pray for them, and I'll pray over them in work, in a secular environment." And I guess he can do that because he's in charge. But you know what? He still takes cue from Dolores. And from the youth pastor and from everyone else who was in his life. And he said it really was the love of some very simple people who softened him to Christ. I think that speaks volumes. Okay. So for us, again, we need to be the hands and feet of people. We need to be people who value, people who love, people who show interest, who invest, again, for the long haul. And finally, Bob, have I extended my time? Do I have time to tell one more story? I hope that's okay. With regard to the relevance of Christianity, I think this is more and more and more common today. There's just not a sense of cultural relevance for Christianity today. We're just seen as, people who don't walk the walk, talk the talk. We're just, the Ned Flanders running around is not attractive or desirable. So how do we change that and build the plausibility of having an attractive, embodied faith? It's really done through the lives that we live. That we live right side up in a world that's upside down. Let's talk about Greg's story. Greg thought that religious faith and Christianity was just totally not relevant. Who's God? God is a dangerous delusion, embarrassing belief, mere social belief. Christianity is not relevant, false, antiquated, superstitious. It's for weak people, weak intellectuals. The Bible is myth, fabrication, ignorant commentary. And where did he get his views? Well, he grew up in, I guess you would call it, a ritualistic Catholic environment. He went to church. He was made to go to church. He said one of the most ingenuous things he thinks he's ever done with his life is he actually went through Catholic confirmation because he didn't believe it the whole time he was going through it. He was made to do it. It felt totally irrelevant to him. He grew up as a very scientifically minded young man. He read a lot of Carl Sagan. He went on to pursue a bachelor's degree in biology. Again, very scientifically minded. It's interesting, his life story, because he didn't like religion or really didn't want anything to do with it, but he ended up dating an Anglican young woman for 4 years in high school. I think that was a bit informative for him, because when you spend four years in a relationship with someone, you get to know their family, they get to know you, and he said they were a very warm, loving, stable, inviting family. They didn't make him feel badly about his beliefs. They embraced him. Now, of course, they didn't marry because of the differences that he had. But it was something that I think played a little bit later. Experientially, he went on to college. It was around when the internet was getting really getting going in the early 90s, and he was Googling atheism, and he found the Freedom from Religion Foundation, Dan Barker, and he said in him he found like this common intellectual kind of colleague in a sense, and he started declaring himself a militant atheist. So he really started almost a vitriol against anything religious. He was, again, very rationally minded. He liked the idea, morally speaking, that this kind of life and worldview gave him a moral blank check, so to speak, which he spent a lot in his 20s. But there came a point in his life that he started to ask this question: is your worldview big enough for your world? Was his worldview big enough for his world? There was something missing. Now, it takes a while sometimes for someone to come to that place. For him, it had a lot to do with meaning and purpose in life. And so let's tell his story, what brought him to a catalyst. Again, he had rejected God. He was rationally superior. He had a real contempt for religion. During his atheist period, interestingly, he married another Christian woman, this time from a Lutheran family. He must have been drawn to, the beauty of Christian women. Love that. Anyway, I'm just going to tell another guy's story, but no time for that. So he was embraced by her family. And there, being around a Christian family, there's something to be said for that. He said as he got into his 30s, he started to lose this sense of enjoyment of the intellectual superiority of his atheism. It just kind of waned. He began to feel the sense of meaninglessness in his life. He said it was almost as if I could see my life. There was really not much to it. It's like my life was a sandcastle built on the shore at low tide, just waiting for the wave to come in and just wipe it out. There's nothing to life. There's no real meaning and purpose. Why do I go to work every day? He said, I wasn't suicidal. I didn't have the courage to do that. But he said meaninglessness was a real driver for him. It opened him up to consider something different. Now, of course, in the background of all of this is this other family. And he said they didn't have much. They lived in a rural area of Canada. They didn't make much money. Through the good times and the bad, they were joyful, kind, stable, loving people who seemed to enjoy life, they had meaning in their lives. He said, one thing that happened to me, he said, is I started watching the depravity of my own moral actions. I started introspectively looking at really the bad choices that I had made because I felt the moral freedom to do it. And he said I turned into a really horrible person. He said I also turned very cynical. And I could see that this Christian family didn't have that. And it spoke volumes to him. And he wanted that. He just didn't have the intellectual wherewithal to go there because he still felt that it was not believable. Well, the next thing that happened is that his wife's grandmother died. And they went to the Mass. And in the Mass, the priest read some scripture. And that evening, he and his wife were home in bed. He said they had a habit of just reading in bed prior to going to sleep. And this particular night, his wife brought up the Bible. And because she wanted to read from the Psalms the way that the priest had read. And so the Bible was up there, and it just kind of stayed up there. So he got curious. He started thinking about death. And he got curious as to what the Bible would say about that. So he started reading the Bible. He said, I know what's in the Gospels. It's just about loaves and fishes and Jesus walking on the water. I know what's in there. So I'm going to start with the book of Acts. So he started with the book of Acts. He was blown away by the seriousness of the apostles, their martyrdom, the intellectual robustness. He went on to Romans, and he just couldn't believe these intellectual figures and writings and the substantive nature of what he was finding in the scripture. And then he went back and read the Gospels, and he was blown away by the courage of Jesus, by his self-serving nature. It was just so other than what he expected. And I can tell you that the power of Scripture is amazing when someone is really willing to look at it. So I'd encourage that. But so it started him to want to know whether or not the Bible is even true. So he started actually looking into apologetics. And that took him to a place where he actually came to a place of belief, intellectual belief. But still, we know that just because someone intellectually assents to the truth of Christianity, that doesn't mean that they are willing or able or to give their heart or their life existentially, spiritually, to the God of the universe. That's a whole nother thing. But he wanted to. He was considering it. He said he sat in this place for about a year and a half. And I will tell you something again, from the wife's point of view and the family, they never pushed him. Didn't say, okay, how's it going? Are you going to become a Christian yet? They also had relational patience. He found himself on a business trip in Montreal, and this is a really poignant part of his story, so I'm going to read it to you. Where he finds himself on a business trip in Montreal. He said, there are so many beautiful cathedrals downtown, and I was just walking through one of the city streets, and there was this beautiful French cathedral. It was just enormous. It's beautiful, and I thought I would just go inside. to see it, and I don't know, reflect or think. I don't know what I was doing. I don't know what God was doing. It had huge granite steps leading up to it. There was a beggar sitting on the stairs leading up to the entrance, and he was begging for change in French, so I didn't understand him. He must have asked me for change, and I think I just dismissed him. I think I said, "No, I can't help you." And I walked right past him. And I was at one end of the cathedral, and there were a series of double doors, master bronze double doors going across all the entrance, all along the front. So I was trying each one in turn to get in, and they were locked. So I was like opening one, then I would walk down 10 feet, open another set, and it wasn't until I got to all of them were locked, and I got down to, I skipped past a set. And I went down to the end, and they were locked. And I heard someone say, "Come, come." And I turned around, and the beggar was there. And he was holding open the double doors for me. And I was so immediately convicted in my heart right at that moment. It wasn't just that he was holding the doors open for me, but even then, at that moment, I realized that this was the grace of God for me, was opening the door to relationship with him. And I was just so convicted. And at that moment, with all of the sin in my life, looking at the face of this man, I was so ashamed of myself. I couldn't look him in the eye, and I was just like, "Thank you." And I walked in. I don't know what, it was just like, I have to believe that he was sent from God. I don't know. I'm sure that man had been there for his whole life, but at that moment, it just had to have been. I was just so convinced of it. It was so humbling. And for him, you know, I can't get in on my own, but God opens the door through the most humble man, the most simple man. And you know, there were so many levels that I could see that it just seemed so biblical to me that God would humble me with this man who I had just dismissed in my haste to go to a church. The irony of that wasn't lost on me. It was pretty intense. I think I sat inside for 40 minutes to an hour in the silence, just reflecting on it, going, well, I prayed to God and I just said, I'll accept. I don't know how I did it. I don't remember the words that I said, but that was the beginning of it for me. It was amazing. It was beautiful. It was great. Yeah, it was pretty cool. So that was what he characterized as a spiritual experience, which is kind of different than Jeremy's. But he ended with a very changed and meaningful life. And in his story, I think it's important again that the lives that we live speak volumes. Sometimes we don't know that it is, but it often brings people to Christ. Generally speaking, in terms of when I looked at the type of catalyst that seemed to draw people towards openness to bring down these resistance, more often than not, it was that Christianity seemed good rather than the truth of it at that point. There was something that was made attractive about God, and it was generally through engagement, one-on-one, personal engagement. When I quantified this through my interviews, nearly 82% had some kind of personal engagement with a Christian who broke down stereotypes and built up plausibility about Christianity, who Christians are, that kind of thing. That it may be possible to believe and be like a normal person, you know, not like Ned Flanders. Of course, there were those who strictly pursued from the beginning in a very intellectual way. Some people are just driven that way. But for the most part, goodness actually opens the door. And once they decide that it's possible, that then there becomes a quest. And they're willing to actually go there and perhaps read the Bible, or maybe disprove the Bible and then find it to be just more than they thought. Perhaps they look at apologetics. Maybe they have a spiritual experience, but they're finding more and more truth as they go, so that by the time they become convinced, then they see how it's applicable or relevant to their own lives. So it's really a journeying. Usually goodness leads truth, and then it's, as you saw at the beginning, it's usually a combination, even as it's a combination of things of why people held to atheism. It's usually a combination of goodness and truth that bring people, and relevance that bring them on into conversion. So at the end of the day, we need to break down stereotypes, build up plausibility through showing the goodness and the love of God, through learning well, representing Christ and Christianity well. We need to live lives that are attractive and holy. I must say that in today's world. And of course, lean on the Holy Spirit. Blaise Pascal sums it up very well. Make religion attractive. Make good men wish it were true. And then show that it is. After all, isn't that the way of Christ, the one who is love, truth, and life? Thank you all for being so patient and for staying with me.